Presentations, we see these demonstrations, and one of them that always comes to mind is the Slake Test. And I think it would be good for you to talk a little bit about what the Slake Test is supposed to show and what we're supposed to learn from this demonstration.
Well, I think we can take a look at the Slake Test from the viewpoint of water coming into a soil bed, which is going to create a pressure. And consequently, we know that this bed is composed of numerous small aggregates bound together and eventually forms a much larger bed. And the bed is dry. It's been drying in the office here for the last 2 weeks. And if you put the bed into the water and the bed already has moisture in it, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to be a bed in the water because it already offsets the pressure that's trying to come in. And so it just stays in a stable form. So the first thing that is necessary here is to dry the bed. And if you can put it into a windowsill or someplace where it dries and maybe turn it now and then. This one's been drying for quite a number of days, so it's a pretty good situation now. And when you put the bed into the water, and the water starts to come into the bed through the pore spaces, it'll create this pressure. And if the glomalin is adequate to hold the pore spaces together, to hold the soil aggregates together, basically you're not going to see much peeling off of the soil or slaking. If it doesn't have much glues in it, you're going to see quite a bit of slaking occur. Okay, and so hence the term slaking. The things that impact this is the soil biology. You know, it's a biological role that is played of building the soil aggregates, and we're looking at plants or root exudates coming off of the plant, the biology engaging and exchanging with those root exudates as one of their primary food sources. And so then hence the glomalin is made by a combination of the fungi and the plant. And the glomalin itself can, if the biology doesn't have an adequate alternate food source, it'll actually eat the glomalin too. And so I thought we'd put some into a water container. This is a fine sandy loam. It's from a farm here in Burleigh County, and it was in a perennial alfalfa for 5-6 years. Then the farmer took it out, and what he did is he harvested the hay early in the year, and then he chemically burned down the alfalfa, and he planted a diverse cover crop mixture. Then the following year he planted corn into the cover crop residue. And so this has been out of alfalfa production for a couple of years now, and into cropping production. So let's see what this fine sandy loam does, and we'll place it in the water, and we'll watch to see how much slaking that we get. It's not uncommon to get some slaking on virtually every bed, but if it's healthy soil, the water container will generally stay quite clean, quite clear. The water quality will be good. And so if you get excessive slaking, then we're saying that we need to go back and improve that soil. And I think that's what the slake can kind of tell us. It's a good test to do on your own farm or your own ranch or your own garden. And when you do it, you'd want to do it in comparison mode. Maybe take one out of your rangeland, maybe take one out of your cropland, one out of your hayland. Maybe take one from cropland that had cover crops and livestock integrated. Maybe take one that has had very low diversity and no covers. And go ahead and place them in containers and then observe what's happening. And I think that'll really tell you quite a bit.
A couple of questions real quick for somebody wanting to do this demonstration. The drying process, you mentioned you set it in a windowsill or try to dry it over time. Would there be any advantage or disadvantage to, say, drying it in a microwave or doing it trying to accelerate the time you'd be ready to dry this?
I've dried them in ovens before, and I've dried them in microwaves before. You can accelerate that a bit and get some of that done quicker. But it actually takes quite a while. The pet will get really hot in a microwave if there's quite a bit of moisture in it. You probably won't pick it up by your hand after a while. But so you can accelerate some of that a little bit quicker. None of them appear to be as good as if you can just let them air dry. So obviously you want enough time to do that then. But if you were short on time and you wanted to do something much quicker, then I think you could go to an alternate source, maybe use an oven or a microwave.
Any advantage to actually digging the pads out as opposed to finding a clod, say, on the surface of a tilled or an untilled system? If you were just to find this on the surface, would there be anything different there?
I haven't observed any difference on there. I'm not saying there isn't, but just in observation, I really haven't found any difference. A lot of times the ones more on the surface are a little drier. And of course, if you're in real dry conditions, they can actually be air dry already.
And behave as you would expect.
Yeah, exactly.
Jill Clapperton raised a point in a presentation we saw recently where she talked about the glomalin. Once you go about 26 days without that living root exudate, that the glomalin starts, it's no longer being produced and it's no longer functioning, it starts to break down. Is there a time that a clod would be out of the ground before it would no longer work under this demonstration?
Well, I've had them in the back of a vehicle before in a plastic tub that they were in there for months. And obviously there was no live plant anymore. We know that the biology starts to actually consume the glomalin, as a food source when we have that kind of environment. And then they just got shuffled around for a number of months, and it was almost like a summer fellow scenario where
right.
Where it actually was starting to break down and mineralize. And what I have eventually found is those PEDs, after 6-8 months didn't seem to perform like they did when they were just taken and first dried.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm kind of anxious to see what happens here. Let's go ahead and drop it in there. See what we get, Jay.
Let's go ahead and put this one in.
A little bit of that initial slaking,
Yep,
just like you described.
we got some slaking coming off of this fine sandy loam, and let's just kind of see how it behaves. At this point in time, the water container really hasn't gotten cloudy yet, but let's give it a little bit of time and just observe it. You can see where the name came from. You can see the slaking that's occurring, why it's called a slake test.
Seeing a little bit of water bubbles on the top. What's going on there?
Well, we know we got oxygen and we know we have pore spaces. And so as the water's coming in, it's displacing some of the oxygen that's in there, and it's actually coming to the surface.
Heard a gentleman the other day describe soil as acting more like a lung. Would that be some of what we're seeing here?
Well, we know that we have to have an exchange of oxygen. We have to have water that can enter it. We have to have oxygen that can go in and out. And so I think I've heard it referred to before as a digestive system. I've also heard before where you're mentioning that it's like a lung capacity for the soil, and I think they both are pretty good comparisons.
My initial read on it, even though this thing has continued to slake, the color of the water still is relatively clear, something similar to drinking water, but it's still continuing to kind of flake off there.
Yeah, we've had ones that we've left set on the counter here for 2 to 3 weeks, and they had complete stability. There was no slaking occurring on them. How long they would have gone, I don't know. We just eventually moved them off the counter. But others, we've seen that they can decompose quite quickly within just a few minutes.
Yeah.
So overall, this one, it's again a fine sandy loam. You're looking at a scenario where overall, I think it's doing fairly well. It doesn't mean there isn't some room for improvement, but it's fairly stable, especially for the soil type that it is.
So we're getting ready to do a slake test here. Tell me, Jay, what are we looking at here with this particular soil pad?
Well, this one is a Williams loam. It was on approximately 8% slope, and I took this particular pad about halfway up the slope. I didn't go to the top, I didn't go to the bottom, I went about halfway up. But it's a Williams loam, and its history was 20 years of CRP in relatively low perennial diversity. So it had some brome, it had some alfalfa, it had a little intermediate, it had some slender. And so it didn't have a lot of diversity. And at the end of 20 years, that diversity was predominantly smooth brome grass at that time.
More than 50%?
Oh yes, I would say probably was crowding 85 to 90%
Wow.
brome at the end of 20-year period. After that, after it expired, the rancher put it into a grazing system. And if I recall correctly, it was about a 6-pasture system. And came in with fairly high, fairly high impact. The densities were up there pretty good. And so his grazing time on here was fairly short, and his recovery time was significant as far as length. One of the observations that we had is the percent alfalfa started to improve after 2-3 years of the grazing system being in place. We started to see an increase in plant diversity, specifically in the alfalfa, and some of the additional plants later as well. But the alfalfa was the first one that we observed a difference in.
Very good.
And what we thought we would do today is do a slake test on this one, Storm, and just see what it is. Now it's been air dried here in the office, and you always want them dry. If there's moisture in these pads, and then you put them into the water, you'll get probably little to no slaking at all, no matter how degraded or the soil is.
It's kind of a function of the pressure gradient.
Yes, as the water comes into the pore spaces and moves into the bed, it creates a pressure. And if the glues are not adequate to hold the soil particles together, they start to slake off from this pressure. And then hence we get the term slake test. And if it's a soil that has good soil health, you're still going to get some slaking generally on most any PED, but the water will stay very clear. And if it's a PED that is poor quality and does not have an adequate amount of glomalin or the glue that holds it together, then you're going to see the slaking occur at a much greater extent, and you're also going to see the water get very cloudy.
Very good.
And so this is ideally in your own farm or your own ranch, you would want to take PEDs from different types of management. Maybe one off of your cropland where you did use cover crops, and maybe one off your cropland where you've never used cover crops. You may want to take them on your rangeland where you've had a good grazing system. Maybe take them on some rangeland that hasn't. And start to put the containers side by side, and then you can get a pretty good feel for how these soils are functioning on your own farm or ranch.
Well, I'm kind of anxious to take a look. Let's see what happens here, Jay.
Well, let's put this pad into the water and allow the water to come into the pad through the pore spaces. We're going to get that in place here. Okay. One of the first things we're observing is we're seeing some air bubbles come to the surface, which really illustrates that it's an aerobic soil, and so we've got air spaces in there. This is a very positive item. We need air exchange in the soil, and that's one of the first observations you see. There's a few loose particles that have come off now and settled on the bottom. At this point in time, you can see that the water is is very clear. Still clear, but we give it a little time and see what it does. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, ideally if you have 2 or 3 soils where you can kind of compare on your own farm or your own ranch, your own garden, that gives you the best analysis of what it is. But right now we've got a soil that's holding together quite well.
I would agree. Any comment about the roots? I notice we've got a lot of root structure in this particular pad.
Yeah, it was coming out of a perennial system. And so we got a pretty good root mass here, and what we're looking at is, well, what builds these glues? And of course it's the soil biology that builds the soil aggregates and allows the pore spaces to be put into a soil. And it's the fungi and the plant together that are going to create the glomalin. And so consequently, if there is no root exudates available, the biology actually will just eat glomalin as well. It can be a food source too. And so it's probably not exactly a one-time coating of glue. It probably repeats that process innumerable times. And consequently, I think at this point we can say we got a fairly stable bed, and we got good water quality. And I think this is something that we all need to work toward in our grazing and cropping systems.
So if this holds out 30 days from now, we could look at this and this bed would still be intact, all it's been submerged in water.
We've had them sit here on the counter for as long as 3 weeks, and if it's a healthy soil, there'll be 3 weeks from now there'll be no change in it. It'll just be just like it is today.
Very interesting, Jay.